Hi everyone, and welcome to this week's Crime and Punishment story. This week I am covering the strange case of James Collins, Elizabeth McGovering and the murder of Mary McLaughlin, which took place in Sunderland in 1891. I hope you will find it interesting. The past lives in this week's case have been quite difficult to find. In some cases, Elizabeth is called McGovering and in others McGovering, which made her difficult to find, and Mary was described in some news articles as the wife of Charles Francis. In others, she was listed under her maiden name, and James was for some reason just as hard to find, so the backstory for all will be quite basic. James Collins was said to be around 19 years old at the time the crime was committed, so would have been born in around 1873. Although his place of birth is unknown, his parents were Michael and Jane, who lived in George Street in Sunderland. James was described as a labourer, although his actual place of work is unknown. Elizabeth McGovering was said to be around 33 years old at the time the crime was committed, so would have been born in around 1858. Her place of birth and parents are unknown, however, she was the aunt of James Collins, as his mother was her sister. She also lived in George Street in Sunderland. Of the name choices, I have decided to go with McGovering, as that is the name that is used on her court details. Mary McLaughlin, or Frances, the victim, was said to be around 27 years old at the time of her death, so would have been born in around 1864. Her place of birth and parents are unknown. She also lived in George Street in Sunderland with Charles Francis, a scissor grinder, and the couple did appear to live as man and wife, but it seems a little unclear if they were actually married or not. Before we go any further, can I just say, if you do enjoy this video, then please give it a thumbs up. And if you are new here or haven't already done so, then do please consider subscribing to the channel to help support the content we create. It really is very much appreciated. And it is completely free to subscribe. It doesn't cost you any money, but it really does help to support the channel. And as always, I just want to add that I do record these stories live, so I do sometimes make mistakes, which I always try to rectify, so I hope this does not spoil your enjoyment of the video. On May the 3rd, 1891, Mary asked Elizabeth for the return of 5.5 pence that she owed her. Elizabeth said she would like to take another halfpenny and would then give her 6 pence back later. Mary said this was no good, she would never see the money again. This resulted in the two women arguing and a fight broke out. James Collins was also in the area of George Street and Sunderland at the time, and for some reason he became involved in the fight, and he also attacked Charles Francis, who had come out to defend Mary, hitting him several times with a poker. Elizabeth then hit Mary over the head with a large dish, and on seeing the blood pouring from Mary's head, she backed off, and both James and Elizabeth went inside another house on George Street just before the police, who had been attracted by the noise of the fight, had arrived. The police asked Mary who had caused her injuries, and she told them it was James Collins. The police at first went to Sunderland High Street, where they had been told James had gone. However, they did not find him, so they went to the home of Michael and Jane Collins, where they believed that James had gone. However, his parents told the police they did not know anyone of that name, and when P.C. Yates found James Collins on the stairs a little later, unaware of who he was for certain, he asked if he was the man he was looking for, and was told he was called Johnson. However, he then called to Michael saying, "They call me Johnson, don't they, father?" Not happy with the reply, P.C. Yates was about to arrest James when his father and mother came out onto the stairs. His mother threw pots and pans at the police officer, and his father attempted to stop him from taking his son. Eventually, all 3 members of the Collins family were arrested and taken to the police station. Dr. Wood had been sent for, and on seeing how serious Mary's injuries were, he sent her to the infirmary. However, she died a short time later, and James Collins was then charged with her willful murder. A short time after this, Elizabeth McGovering went to the police station and made a statement that she alone had been responsible for the death of Mary McLaughlin and that James had not been involved. She was also arrested and charged with willful murder, but despite her best efforts, James was not released and also remained on the charge of murder. Prior to the inquest, a hearing was held at the Magistrate's court, and here it was stated that Elizabeth McGovering had handed herself into the police station and made the following statement. She said she alone had been the one who had struck Mary McLaughlin. She said she had owed Mary around 5 pence and Mary had argued with her about it. Elizabeth said she had given her 6 pence and had been given a penny back, but the argument had continued. She said she decided to leave and was heading up the passage to her mother's house. She said as she was leaving, Mary came up to her and struck her on the arm with a poker. Elizabeth said this made her mad and she picked up a large dish and hit Mary over the head with it. The dish had broken and she had taken it away and hidden it, and she said it was under the bed at her mother's house. A police officer had later searched the house and found the remains of the dish, parts of which appeared to be stained with blood. Elizabeth had continued, saying that during the earlier argument James Collins had been passing. He had stopped and asked what was wrong, and she said he told her not to kick up a row and to go inside the house. She said James did not hit anyone. After this, PC Yates and PC Lever spoke of attending the scene on the night in question. They said after Mary told him who had attacked her, and with a description of James Collins, they had tried to find him on Sunderland High Street, where they had been told that he had gone. However, he was nowhere to be seen, so they had returned to George Street to his parents' home. PC Yates said he had spoken to Mr. and Mrs. Collins, and they had denied that anyone of that name lived there. He said as he was about to leave, he met James Collins on the stairs. He asked his name as he looked much like the man that the witnesses had described earlier. He denied his name was Collins and then turned to Mr. Collins, who was still standing on the stairs, and said, "Tell him, father, my name is Johnson." PC Yates, not fooled by this, attempted to arrest James and he resisted quite violently, and he said this resulted in both of his parents doing the same. And PC Yates said James appeared to be quite drunk at the time. He said Mrs. Collins began to throw pots and pans at them and anything she could lay her hands on. He said it was absolute chaos, but with the help of PC Lever and other police officers who had now arrived, they were able to arrest not just James, but also Michael and Jane Collins as well, and they were all taken to the police station and charged. At this point, Michael and Jane Collins were placed in the dock. Both had bandages on their heads and other marks on their bodies, and it was said that traces of blood could be seen on their clothes. They were both charged with assaulting PC Yates and PC Lever, who had both received serious injuries in the fight. And although the full details were not covered, it would seem that Mr. and Mrs. Collins attempted to blame the police for the fight. Both police officers said they had not attacked them without warning, had not knocked Mr. Collins to the ground, and had not struck him several times while he was on the ground. They stated that they had drawn their truncheons when James had asked his mother to pass him a knife, and when the fighting began to get out of hand. PC Lever did admit that he had struck Jane Collins during the fight, but said it had been accidental and not deliberate. He also stated that Jane Collins did not pass her son the knife he had asked for. Michael Collins also stated that he had not said he did not know anyone of the name James Collins. He said he had told the officers that no one of that name lived with them, as James lived in a different part of the building. Jane Collins stated that she had told her son to go quietly. There was no point in fighting, as he would have to go eventually. The magistrates at this told Jane if her own actions had been as good as her advice, she herself would not now be in court. After this, the magistrates held a brief discussion and then sentenced Michael Collins to 3 months penal servitude and Jane to 1 month. Both of them thanked the magistrates, and as they were leaving, Michael attempted to say something, and Jane pushed him in the back and said, "Shut up, you fool." They were then removed from the courtroom. The inquest was held at Sunderland Infirmary before Coroner Maynard. Now, I have struggled to find the details of who identified Mary McLaughlin. I feel sure that I read an article which said Charles Francis had identified her when I was first researching the story, but I have been unable to find it since. However, I think we can assume he would have been the one to have identified the body. Robert Young of Sunderland said he had been in George Street on the night in question. He heard a woman shouting murder and headed towards the passage where he saw a fight taking place. He said he saw James Collins hitting Charles Francis with a poker. The man was on the ground and unable to get up. He said he then saw Elizabeth McGovering hit Mary McLaughlin over the head with a dish, and when she saw the blood flowing from Mary's head, he said Elizabeth gave up the fight and stood silently for a moment. He said he went to James and managed to get the poker from his hands. He said Elizabeth grabbed this from him and said she was going to hit Mary with it, but Robert said James took her arm and dragged her inside the house. He said as he turned back towards where Mary had been, he saw Mrs. Askew, a neighbour in the street, leading her out of the passage. When asked, he said he did not see James hit Mary with the poker. In fact, he did not see him hit her at all, and he only saw Elizabeth hit her once. He also could not say if James and Elizabeth had been drunk at the time of the attack. Mrs. Isabel Askew said she also lived in George Street in Sunderland and had been in the street on the night of May the 3rd. She heard a disturbance and then Mary appeared near to the passage entrance. She said she fell into her arms saying, "Bella, I am murdered." Isabel said she helped her to her feet and was going to take her up Coronation Street to the police station, but she fell to the floor and could walk no further. She said it was a few moments after this that the police arrived on the scene. Mary Macpherson said she had been in George Street on the night of the 3rd of May. She said she heard Mary McLaughlin ask Elizabeth for the money she owed her. She said Elizabeth said she didn't have it, but if she gave her another halfpenny, she would give her 6pence back later. She said Mary McLaughlin said, "If I do that, I will not get it back at all." She said Elizabeth then gave Mary 6pence and asked for half a penny back. She said a minute or two later, Elizabeth said something that upset Mary, and she said after this, those two women, Mr. McGovering and James Collins, all began to fight in the passage. She said she did not see Mr. Francis there. She said she did not stay in the area and quickly left, so she did not see anyone with a poker or any dishes, and she did not hear Mary McLaughlin shouting murder. Mary Kelly of Sunderland said she had been standing near the passage on the night in question. She had heard the argument over the money. She said she saw Mary go up to Elizabeth and strike her with the poker. She said she shouted out to Elizabeth and told her to get herself inside out of the way. She said she saw no more after this as she herself went inside. P.C. Yates said he found Mrs. Askew and Mary McLaughlin on the way to Coronation Street. He said Mary was in a bad way. She was carried to the police station and a doctor was sent for. He said he had asked her what had happened and she had told him James Collins did this. He said two young boys had been standing close by and they told him James had gone to the High Street. They gave him a good description of James and he went to look for him but did not find him there, so went to his parents' home. After this, his evidence was the same as that which he had given at the magistrate's hearing. Dr. Wood of Sunderland said he had been called to the police station on the night of May the 3rd. He said he found Mary with serious wounds to her head. He said she was almost insensible, having lost a lot of blood, and he arranged for her to be sent to Sunderland Infirmary. Dr. Larkham and Dr. Murphy of Sunderland Infirmary said they had examined Mary on her arrival. They were quickly aware that she had a fracture to the skull. Despite every attempt, Mary died at around 1 p.m. the following day. No post-mortem details were given, but I think we can assume the fracture to the skull and blood loss would have been given as the cause of death. Superintendent Huntley said he had been on duty at the police station when Elizabeth McGovering came to hand herself in. He said she wanted to confess and he warned her about doing so, as anything she would say would be used in evidence against her. He said she told him it had all been over 5 pence and that James Collins had told her to go inside. She said she was going to until Mary struck her with the poker and she then hit her with the dish. He said he had sent P.C. Watson to look for the dish where Elizabeth said she had hidden it. PC Watson said he had gone to the home of Elizabeth's mother and looked under the bed. He said the broken dish was where she said it would be. It had stains on it that appeared to be blood. He was taken back to the police station and shown to Elizabeth, and she said that was the dish she had hit Mary with. No evidence seems to have been taken from Charles Francis, and there is also no evidence to suggest that any charges were ever given to James Collins for having attacked him with a poker. So what happened on that particular part of the story is very unclear. The coroner then spoke to the jury, saying it was for them to decide if the death of Mary McLaughlin had been caused by one or both of the prisoners. It was clear her death had been as a result of the fight that night, but who was the most responsible for it? The jury retired for a short time before returning a verdict of guilty of manslaughter against both James and Elizabeth, and they were committed for trial. I did not find any details of a funeral for Mary McLaughlin. It is not clear if she had any family in the area, nor is it clear if Charles had money to pay the costs, so again this may have been a pauper's funeral. I did not find any evidence of a headstone for Mary anywhere in the area. The trial took place in Durham in July of 1891 before Mr. Justice Grantham. Both James and Elizabeth pleaded not guilty to the charge of manslaughter. As is often the case, the majority of the evidence given at the trial is the same as that given at the inquest, so I will only include any new information. Elizabeth McGovering was called to give evidence. The statement she made the day after the murder was read to her, and she now stated it was not true. She said the friends of James Collins did not like her much, and she'd been afraid that they may come after her if she did not say he was not involved. She then stated that she had also not hit Mary with the dish. She said she was about to when James told her not to do it, and she said she fell back, dropped the dish, and that was how it was broken. She said after this, Mary had struck James and he had picked up the poker and hit her with it. Dr. Larkham of Sunderland Infirmary said the wound to the head of Mary McLaughlin could have been caused by either a poker or by being struck over the head with a heavy dish. James Collins does not seem to have given evidence on his own behalf, which I found a little odd in light of the fact that his aunt had now withdrawn her earlier statement, saying he was not involved. There were no details of either the defence or the prosecution speaking to the jury, and I have to say that I on this occasion would not attempt to imagine what they might have said due to Elizabeth's changed statement. The judge, in summing up, simply stated that it was clear that this was a case of manslaughter. However, who was responsible for the death of Mary McLaughlin was not so clear, and they must decide who they felt was responsible for her death. The jury retired for 25 minutes before returning a verdict of guilty of manslaughter against both Elizabeth and James. They recommended Elizabeth to mercy due to provocation from Mary McLaughlin. The judge then sentenced James Collins to 12 months penal servitude with hard labour and Elizabeth McGovering to 18 months penal servitude. I did not find any further details for either James or Elizabeth after this date. This was a very strange story, as they often are. Sadly, it seems money was the reason that the fight began in the first place, but it seems there may have been bad feeling between the two women prior to this, as it does seem that Mary didn't seem to trust Elizabeth to pay her the money back, and it seems that Elizabeth, although I didn't add any of the things she said about Mary, as it was mostly swearing, did not seem to like Mary all that much, so it seems that it took very little to spark the fight between them. James seems to have joined in the fight simply because he was drunk at the time and not thinking clearly, and he appears to have attacked Charles Francis because he was trying to defend Mary, and he himself was perhaps trying to defend his Aunt Elizabeth by attacking Charles. But whether or not he struck Mary with the poker is unknown, as no one other than Elizabeth in her changed statement spoke of seeing him do so. It's not clear how Elizabeth's husband was involved in the fight, as only one witness said he was there at the time, and he did not give evidence, so perhaps he was there, but not involved and went inside out of the way. And the bizarre attempt by James to say he was someone called Johnson was actually quite amusing, especially when he called Michael father, making it very clear that he was his son and indeed called Collins. However, I do believe that Johnson was the maiden name of his mother, but I'm not 100% certain on that one, but I just thought I would add that in there. Were the jury correct to find both Elizabeth and James guilty? Well, yes, I believe they were. Even if James had not struck the fatal blow, I personally believe that was Elizabeth. They had both been involved, and I think he may well have struck Mary prior to Elizabeth hitting her with the dish, which would no doubt have contributed to her death. And I believe that Elizabeth was only given a prison term without hard labour because of the jury recommending her to mercy. But what do you think? Do you think it was James who struck the fatal blow with the poker, or do you think it was Elizabeth with the dish? Do you think Elizabeth changed her statement in the hope that she would not get sent to prison? Or do you really think she changed it because she wasn't guilty and had given the first statement as she was afraid of the friends of her nephew, so wanted to take the blame at first and now regretted doing so? Do you think the jury were correct to find both guilty, or do you think only one of them should have been found guilty, and if so, which one? Do please let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I do hope you have found this sad and tragic story interesting, and I do thank you all very much for watching, and I do hope to see you all again next week.